Remember that Trump has sort of transformed himself into a national yo-yo. One day, he sounds eminently reasonable. The next day, it's total war. He seems to be Dr. Strangelove on one day and, Mr. Peacemaker the next. I don't think he knows what he's doing, and I don't think anybody around him does. I think the people around him are cashing in on the market. This is not going to work much longer. We're now up to $85 a barrel. I think eventually this entire charade about petroleum and energy is going to be dropped and the world's going to slide into a major, major crisis. And I think for a lot of people, it will be depression. But what is he going to do? The only thing he knows how to do is to order the forces that we have to inflict more pain on Iran. And I think he's convinced himself that if he inflicts enough pain, miraculously, the Iranians will all come out of the cave with their hands over their heads, begging for mercy. Well, I don't see any evidence that that will work.
Donald Trump is fighting to the last missile, unable to back out of a war against Iran that he started with Israel. No clear diplomatic strategy of how to reach some sort of settlement with Iran, unable to support the Gulf states that have depended on the US for decades, overly hitched to the Israeli lobby in the US, facing a reality that when the war ends, he has significant problems in the USA that he also needs to face up to. Where does that leave us? I get into this discussion with Doug Macgregor today. I hope you find the conversation interesting, if unfortunately rather downbeat in terms of its prospects. The bottom line is this: Trump could back out of this, but is he capable psychologically of doing so, recognizing the impact on US prestige that his failure in Iran will have? My name is Ian Proud and I'm the Peacemonger. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your nationality and your religion, I wish you very much peace. And now for today's video. How have things been? Been busy, keeping an eye on what's happening in, everywhere really, particularly with the Middle East, which appears to be the real flashpoint right now.
Standing on the edge of the volcano, staring into the abyss and watching and waiting for the inevitable eruption that's going to swallow everything.
That reminds me of a movie with Tom Hanks, actually. But yeah, I mean, it kind of takes me. There's a danger when we kind of look at the news cycle that we get locked in the here and now and kind of transport you back to the start of March, shortly after the kind of military hostility started against Iran, when Rubio set out the US's 3 strategic aims for the campaign. The first was regime change. The second was to degrade Iran's missile capabilities. And the third was the nuclear program. Fast forward to today, we don't seem to really make progress on any of those. And now Trump is threatening strikes on civilian targets. I mean, is there a plan? What is the plan?
Well, I think you enumerated the wish list, which was never a strategy. People get confused. Oh, we have a strategy. These are the things we want. Really? You know what you want. That's nice. How do you plan to achieve that? We've never had an answer to that question because there is no strategy, and we have no strategy at this point. I think where we are is very simple. We now face the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We understand the catastrophic nature of that. Many of us were pleased when Donald Trump signed off on the 14 points, even though he recognized that these were 14 points that were difficult for him to live with, because we said, well, the man's wised up. He recognizes that the global economy is in serious trouble, that if he doesn't end this quickly and open the strait, he'll destroy the whole global energy complex, which will cause the world largely to slide into, at best, a bad recession, more likely a depression, depending upon where you are. We've been through, what are we missing? We're missing fertilizer. We're missing all sorts of rare metals. We're missing, by the way, helium, which is vital and essential to the microchip industry. But we're looking at famine now in many countries. India is in very serious trouble, and they're very unhappy about it. They've now abandoned their previous position of support for Israel and recognize that Israel is a catalyst for conflict and trouble and is hurting them. The rest of Asia has followed suit, but increasingly people are hating us because they see us as the enabler, and justifiably so. So I think Trump is doing the only thing left that he can think of. And remember that Trump has sort of transformed himself into a national yo-yo. One day, he sounds eminently reasonable. The next day, it's total war. He seems to be Dr. Strangelove on one day and, Mr. Peacemaker the next. I don't think he knows what he's doing. And I don't think anybody around him does. I think the people around him are cashing in on the market. He and his billionaire friends are manipulating the market, artificially suppressing the price of petroleum and the products that are derivative. This is not going to work much longer. We're now up to $85 a barrel. I think eventually this entire charade about petroleum and energy is going to be dropped and the world's going to slide into a major, major crisis. And I think for a lot of people, it will be depression. But what is he going to do? The only thing he knows how to do is to order the forces that we have to inflict more pain on Iran. And I think he's convinced himself that if he inflicts enough pain, miraculously, the Iranians will all come out of the cave with their hands over their heads, begging for mercy. Well, I don't see any evidence that that will work. So where do you go from here? More of the same. Now, and I'm sure you've heard this, Ian, there's a lot of talk about ground forces. And I think that that's a manifestation of the desperation. And I think we should talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, there won't be any ground forces from Europe. Europe's not been willing to introduce any ground forces into Ukraine, as you know, Doug. So, I mean, I suppose strategically that the question that then is, what would be the objective? And actually, how long would it take to summon up sufficient capabilities, by which time one assumes the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed throughout that time? The global economy would have gone even into an even worse state. So, you can't just have ground troops, as you know, from Desert Storm with Danny Davis. It'll take 6 months. I mean, how long would it take the US to introduce ground troops in this remarkable scenario of a land campaign?
Well, I think they can introduce what they have on hand very quickly. That consists of light forces. And that's where you go into this exercise of trying to figure out what would they do for you if you were to employ them. Now, I worked closely off and on for many years with Wes Clark, whom I normally regard as an extraordinarily bright man. Didn't agree with him on many things, but we always remained friends. He's been arguing for an attack to seize Karg Island on the assumption that seizing this island is going to harm Iran, destroy its access to wealth from oil, and this will somehow or another provide us with some degree of influence in future negotiations, whatever that means, with Iran. And then suddenly, not to my surprise, I expected this from this General McKenzie, who was formerly the U.S. Central Command commander who presided over or was actually the architect of the departure from Afghanistan a few years ago. He's now saying, we ought to seize Karg Island. We'll have a great bargaining chip. And we'll be standing on Iranian soil, and that's got to mean something. I've heard various people talk about Chabahar and other islands in the Persian Gulf, but principally Karg Island or Chabahar on the assumption that if you get in there and you hold this, it's going to make a difference in Tehran. Nobody seems to understand that we have no means of defending anybody that we put on these islands, let alone in Chabahar. Iran views all of this as an existential threat. If you were to go into Chabahar, or let's say you were dumb enough to think that you could pour troops into Bushehr or Bandar Abbas, well, I think the Iranians would effectively flatten the place with you in it. The Iranians are going to behave much as the Soviets did as they retreated in front of the Germans, or as the Russians did as they retreated in front of Napoleon. They'll destroy everything. And whatever you think you're holding will be of absolutely no value whatsoever. They seem to be stuck in a colonial or almost imperial era where they regard Iran as something that you could sort of beat into submission. There was a British intervention in the Persian Gulf. I've forgotten the details. It's been so long since I looked at it. They landed on the on the western coast, or excuse me, eastern coast of the Persian Gulf. They held something hostage there, and finally the Shah said, fine, I'll sign off on the trade agreement or whatever it was. The British have done similar things, but those days are over. No one's going to sign anything or give us anything under any circumstances. And we forget that both sides can escalate. Iran has never fully exploited all of its capabilities against us. It's not in their interest to do that. They've held back. But if you go ashore in these places, they're going to hit you with everything they have. We can't stop most of these missiles. We can't stop the unmanned systems that are these Shahad missile. They're essentially what? They're cruise missiles, cheap, but there are thousands of them. We can't stop them. So what do? You end up with an epic failure, a catastrophe from which it's not easy to recover. We'll look like the British did in Afghanistan in the 1840s, and the famous painting, All That Was Left of Them. There's no need to do it. I mean, the rational actor in Washington would reach the following conclusions. Number one, the average American could care less what happens there. So why are we worried? And that's true. The average American doesn't even know where it is. Could care less. How are we dependent upon what comes out of the Gulf? Well, somewhat, but not heavily. In other words, we can push elsewhere if we have to get what we need. But we are harming the world. That doesn't make any sense. Do we want to do that? Absolutely not. That would be the last thing. It's very easy to stand up and say, we've looked at everything. We don't see that we can make any headway here. This is a humanitarian disaster now. So under the circumstances, we're disengaging. And we'll deal with this government in the future in other ways. We'll certainly sit down and talk with them, but it's clear that at this point, our military instrument is not the right answer. And come home and begin the process of figuring out what kind of military you're going to need for the future. Because what you've got is obviously not the answer, right?
Yeah.
So these are the things that a rational actor would do. But we have this man, Netanyahu. We have the Jewish state. We have its billionaire representatives inside the United States. And they are absolutely determined to destroy Iran. And so Donald Trump's, progression, as you enumerated at the beginning, from regime change all the way up to utterly destroy Iran has now occurred. And he's even talking about going back to Pickaxe Mountain and bombarding it, where allegedly beneath it are nuclear capabilities that he formerly said he destroyed. And everybody knows that you're not going to make much headway there unless you use at least a 5 to 10 kiloton nuclear weapon. Why would we do that? And again, people say, well, they're a threat to the United States. There's no evidence for that. How can you argue that Iran is a threat to the United States in any way, and then turn around and say, well, we should be through in 3 or 4 days, which is what they said at the beginning? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow logically. So, Ian, I think we're in a very desperate position. And now we know that Mr. Netanyahu is flying back to the United States for Senator Graham's funeral. And he should. No one is a more loyal servant of Greater Israel than Lindsey Graham. Every time that Mr. Netanyahu visits, we end up going into war again. We end up with another round of senseless destruction. So I think that's where we're headed. Now, will this be the last round? I have no idea.
Yeah. It won't surprise you that I'm not flying back for Lindsey Graham's funeral. I mean, this all comes back to the American people, right? Because you've got elections coming up. I mean, Trump, I couldn't wait to see the back of Biden. I mean, I don't support any political party, and I'm English in any case. I thought Biden was a complete disaster. But Trump came to power on the promise to improve the lives of ordinary American blue-collar, workers, and to focus on them, and to go back to kind of Carg Island, a scenario which, like you, I agree would be militarily a disaster. Not only are they going to suffer economically, but what happens when the body bags start coming back in large numbers? How much ordinary American people seeing the risk picture, looking forward from how this is starting to kind of play out?
Well, if you go back and look at the French Revolution, there were 3 principal causes. Number 1, debt, financial catastrophe. Number 2, deception. Everyone was being lied to. 90% of the wealth rested in the hands of 10% of the population, and 90% of the population was paying taxes, and the 10% that had everything wasn't. Sound familiar? And then the last piece, after debt and deception, injustice. The sense that you are not represented. The people who are sitting in power don't give a damn about you. I think that's where we are. I think that's where you are in Great Britain.
We are.
The French are. I think it's where the Germans are. Now, I don't know about the rest. The Italians and the Spaniards seem to be a little bit better off. I can't evaluate that. I'm not familiar with it. But certainly I know in Germany, people are very frustrated and would like to see fundamental change in Berlin. But the Germans, the problem with the Germans, and with all the Germanic countries, this is true also of Scandinavia, was described by Lenin, who said that if you told the Germans, come to Berlin for a revolution, they would all go to the railroad station. They would buy tickets, probably economy or second class. They would ride comfortably to Berlin. They would get off, and then they would expect to be led to the location where the revolution was to occur. He said, now, if I turn to the Russians and I say, I want a revolution, I want you to be here tomorrow, they would run to the railroad station. They would kill the conductor, kill the engineer, take over the train, throw everybody else off, light their torches and head for Berlin to destroy everything. He was very frustrated because he was trying to foment revolution in Germany after he'd established himself in Moscow. Well, I think that's still true. And one wonders, what will it take? I think the British people are not quite as rigid and submissive as the Germans, but more than I expected them to be. I get these notes all the time. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I always tell them the same thing. It says, well, my ancestors left, but I can tell you that my ancestors that were there would have long, long since pulled swords and dirks and gone to work on the locals and gotten rid of the people they didn't like. And we went to jail for it. My ancestors sat in jail for that sort of thing, but we survived. We're still here. And I think they brought that mentality of unwilling to tolerate tyranny to the United States. And it's deeply embedded in us. I'm wondering when this manifests itself with those of us who are really Americans. And I think that's what it boils down to. I don't know who is an American anymore. I know I am. But we got a lot of strange things happening in this country, and we're pretending lots of people are Americans who clearly are not. I think this war in the Middle East is bringing this to light because the average American is saying, wait, well, what are we doing over there? The bond market is at 4.5% now for a 10-year Treasury bond, a yield, a gilt. And everybody tells me that 10 years is the bellwether of economic disaster. If it hits 5%, most people that are looking at the economy right now say that's default. We fall apart. We can't service the debt. And we have to raise these interest rates to attract capital. We can only buy so much of this ourselves, which is what we've done, obviously. So I think we're in a lot of trouble, Ian, as a country. I think the West is in trouble. And we're going to have to deal with all of these things. And that's why people say, well, how do you think this war with Iran will end? I said it'll end when we're on the verge of bankruptcy. We can't afford to stay. But I don't see any agreement emerging.
Yeah. I mean, in the UK and in France and in Germany, to a certain extent, politics is changing. We're moving beyond the old political parties. You've got the emergence of the Reform Party. You've got the kind of National Rally is kind of surging in France. You've got AFD now. Who knows where that will kind of lead? But the point is that the traditional parties are falling out of favour. Where I suppose the difference, if there is one with the US, is that you have a rigid party political setup with two parties that basically have the same policy towards Israel and Iran. And there is no choice or any obvious evolution in the politics in the US, like we're slowly, very slowly starting to see here. And a new voice is coming through in the US politically saying, well, actually, can we break this cycle of over-attachment to the Israel, lobby? Because, I'm thousands of miles away, of course, but from this distance, I can't see it.
At this point, I think it's not going to happen, but it will happen. When I say at this point, what's going on? I would say probably a majority of the electorate has discovered that elections don't matter. It's not just a question of Republicans or Democrats, because it doesn't make much difference who you vote for. You get pretty much the same outcome. No one has sorted out the real issue for us, which is this massive influx of millions of people into the country that we never wanted, that we didn't invite. The borders were just thrown open. And the tendency in the past was to say, well, this is too hard, it's too much trouble. This is what Reagan said. Well, we'll just go ahead and we'll grant some sort of path to citizenship to these illegals, and that'll be the end of it. It won't happen anymore. Well, the opposite occurred, as we all know. And if you raised your voice against it, well, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're all of these things. I don't think that's playing so well anymore. I think people have becoming more and more inured to the accusation that they are evil because they're white and they're bigots and all this kind of nonsense. And things are getting much worse. The top 10 cities in the United States are now majority non-white. And that's not because we deliberately set out to import large numbers of people who are not Europeans. The white people have left. Now, cities are very important in any society. They anchor your culture and your civilization. They are also the centers, or should be the centers, of prosperity and innovation and change in a positive sense. That's all being swept away now. So you have a divide emerging in the United States that is racial, cultural, financial, economic. All of these things are converging into, I think, the perfect storm. I think the perfect storm here will overwhelm whatever's happening overseas, because the simple truth is If you left the Persian Gulf tomorrow morning and simply said, fine, we're out, we're no longer going to pursue this matter for the reasons that I outlined, and came home, it would have very little effect in the United States. The average voter would say, well, it's about time. Let's get down and face these other issues. The problem is when you begin to face the issues that we're discussing, it's ugly. People really don't want to go there, but they're going to have to. I mean, I sent you something that was sent to me this morning from this young lady in New York City.
I was going to ask you about that, yeah. The radicalization piece, yeah.
I mean, you might show that to your audience, and then we can talk about it, because it's something I didn't expect, which tells you that I'm probably not as in touch with reality as I should be.
Yeah, I mean, the video is, I'll attach it to the kind of recording. The video is of a young American Muslim woman talking about jihad.
Well, I'm assuming she has American citizenship. You see, increasingly, we in the United States, we just went through this business about birthright citizenship, and the Supreme Court struck down any attempt to stop, to forestall that. But increasingly, Americans are saying, wait a minute, you have American citizenship, fine, but you're not an American. And people are fundamentally making this point. This woman illustrates it, in my judgment. Why would you come into a country that you say you want to be part of, you want to live in it, and then tell everybody it needs to radically change to conform to me, to my preferences, the way I think things ought to be? And frankly, I don't give a damn about this thing that you call English-speaking society or Anglo-Saxon culture, laws, and civilization. Doesn't mean anything to me. I have no part in that. Therefore, that must go away and be replaced by whatever I say is now America. That's happened in New York City. That's obvious.
Yeah, I mean, I think this rise of individualism, where people no longer feel they have a responsibility to the society at large, is partly to do with that. I think you can see that woke culture is kind of related to that. People want to express themselves. They don't want to feel they have any responsibility to the people around them and to the wider community, or indeed to work. Hence the welfare sort of culture. I kind of blame that sort of excessive. I mean, you need individualism in a capitalist society up to a point, right? But that kind of erosion of personal responsibility to the community, I think, that's what I see. I mean, I don't know what your sense is.
We've been down that road before about the dangers of dependency on the state. That's worth exploring, but I don't think that's the heart of the problem now. I think we have over 50 million people inside the United States who were not born here. That's the largest percentage of the population that was not born in this country that we've ever had. And when people go back through immigration, they don't understand how different things were. Between 1815 and 1924, we had a total of 32 million people come to the United States. They came from Europe, all over Europe. 2 million of them went back because they could not assimilate. That's how tight and cohesive our society was. Now, 32 million over more than a century, and we've had at least, 40 million over the last 20 years, 25 years, something like that. I think it's more than we can cope with. I think these things are beginning to have an impact. And what's interesting to me is the sort of masterful way in which President Trump and his supporters have manipulated the markets, because they're very sensitive to what the stock market does. They'll do almost anything to keep it afloat. And they know that they're on very thin ice. They watch the bond market too. But I think they're running out of rope. I don't think they can suppress reality too much longer. They're very worried. What are they going to do when this breaks into the open? So we're in a race right now. On the one hand, we have an insoluble problem. It's called not just Iran any longer, but the Persian Gulf. We continue to talk about our role in the region when it's been made perfectly clear that our role is over. It's over because we can't protect the people that live there. So if you say your partners, strategic partners, we use this word a lot, but it's misleading. If you look at Bahrain or Qatar or UAE or Saudi Arabia, these people have been strategic partners for a very long time. We don't need to go back over why. We inherited much of this from you, as you know. But the point is, we can't protect them. And that's the lesson of the war. And Israel has embarked upon a war of territorial expansion and essentially a war to permanently establish in their minds their hegemony, Jewish supremacy in the Middle East. We are harnessed to this process. That's our purpose. We're not there for any particular American strategic reason, because it is not in our interest to be at war with most of the Islamic world. Now, we have a problem with this young lady that's in New York City that seems to want to declare jihad and Islamicize America. That's unacceptable. But we're not interested in Christianizing the Middle East. We're not there on a crusade. So the question is, what the hell are we doing? And the answer is whatever Israel wants. And more Americans are figuring that out. The problem is we're running out of options. So when you start talking about ground forces, I think the president said the 82nd, which is 10,000 paratroopers, and some portion of the Marine Corps, probably an MEF of some kind, Marine Expeditionary Force of perhaps 10, 15,000. You're seizing something, a piece of land. And in the process of doing so, you hope to arrive with minimal damage. Then you have to stay there and protect yourself from massive incoming projectiles and missiles and so forth. You still have to feed and supply people with everything. The only island in the Persian Gulf, interestingly enough, that has a spring is Karg Island. They have fresh water. All the other islands are desert islands. They're rocks. Then you have this thing, Chabahar, on the southern coast. Well, once you land there and you take over this thing, you're going to become a target. But what does it do for you? Is it now a lily pad that's going to be used to further invade this nation of 93 million that's the size of Western Europe? Now, if you're going to say, well, we've got to win this, we're going to declare war. Okay. This means that you're going to draft into uniform millions of people. You would need at least several 100,000 troops on the ground. None of them are particularly well trained. We weren't very well trained during World War II. I mean, we have this terrible myth about the Second War that really does damage to us, where we say, well, we won the Second World War. How many times have you heard Donald Trump say that? It's crazy. Well, we also had the British Empire as an ally. And even though they weren't strictly speaking an ally, we had the benefit of the Soviet military that was dying in vast numbers fighting the Germans, but in doing so, pushing the Germans back in an attrition-based war. We didn't do these things on our own, but he creates this notion that we did. And there are a lot of Americans that don't understand this was not some grand, marvelous march to victory. We took terrible losses. Now, our losses were nothing compared to what the Soviets took. And frankly speaking, you lost everything in the war. If you go back to Corelli, read his book on the decline of British power, it's clear that Churchill mortgaged everything, the empire, the nation, standard of living, wealth, everything, to winning this war against the Germans, even though he had the Imperial General Staff telling him over and over and over again, it's not in our interest to replace the National Socialists with communists. You may want to reconsider what you're doing. It didn't have, it fell on deaf ears. It was too late. When he finally showed up, I think it was in early March of 1945, and told Eisenhower, it would be terribly useful if we controlled Berlin, Prague, and Vienna when the war ended. Really, those are parts of Western civilization. We have to have those. Eisenhower looked at him, what are you, crazy? We had just lost, a couple of 100,000 casualties fighting our way through Belgium and Luxembourg. How do you want us to do this? Are we going to then take on the Soviets? And we glorify Patton for many reasons, some good, some bad. But we don't know that when he spoke to all the troops at the end of World War II and said, gosh, I really wish I could go with you because you're going to go to the Pacific and have the opportunity to kill Japanese. He was booed off the stage. We had divisions rebel. They refused to go. People don't get it. They don't understand it. They didn't live through it. Most of their families were never in it. Everybody had it. When we dropped the atom bomb, whether or not we should have, that's another discussion, but my father was in Okinawa. And he said people cheered everywhere. Let's go home. Nobody wanted to keep fighting. Everybody had it. Now, we're not a Soviet-style totalitarian state. We're not even a Nazi authoritarian state, contrary to what the left likes everybody to believe. We're a relatively free country. We're a republic. We don't do these things very well. We have been fighting these imperial wars on the cheap, following the British model. We finally bitten off something we can't easily subdue, but no one wants to admit that.
And young Americans are not exactly going to be willing to kind of line up to fight in the unlikely event that you went for full conscription, right? Much like we're seeing in Ukraine with the Bussification. Young people just don't want to fight. I
think most of these Americans, if you told them we're guarding the Mexican border and we're going to defend the United States against the drug cartels, and we're going to stop the movement of millions of people into our country that we didn't invite, who are not people we want, I think they would support that without hesitation. In fact, I've asked people those questions whenever I travel and I speak to audiences. Everybody is 100% for defending the United States, but they don't see any evidence that we're defending the United States. And they're right. We're not.
Yeah, well, what's absolutely clear to me is that Trump almost psychologically has no way out of this, just because of the nature of his personality and the fact that he's making a lot of money from it as well, as are his friends. He's just so narcissistic, it seems to me, that he needs approval at every step. And, well, I said right at the start of the conflict back in February that, if Trump finishes it quickly, he looks weak, and if he goes on longer, he looks incompetent. And between those 2 points, there are no good options, for him. So there's no way, it seems to me, that Trump can come out of this and spin it as any sort of a success. And that's why he can't stop. I mean, exactly the same psychological kind of trap that European leaders have got into with the war in Ukraine, because they know that when it stops, they will have failed and be seen to have failed. And I fear that that's where Trump is now, quite frankly.
Well, look, I think the difference is this. Trump can back out of this for the reasons I've already outlined. Now, is this going to hurt us with people overseas? In many cases, yes. In many cases, no. I think a lot of people in various parts of the world, depending upon how he frames this when he speaks publicly, would welcome our disengagement. And if he presents it as a disengagement, for the reasons that we've outlined, at home, I think he would be supported. The last polls I've seen have been between 67 and 75% are opposed to the war in the Persian Gulf. When Eisenhower extracted us from Korea, the polling at that point was something like 55% opposed, 25% for, and the rest undecided. And he simply said, no, we're not going to do this. And he went to Korea and he received a briefing from General Mark Clark. And I'm sure you know who he was. He commanded in Italy. He has a mixed record with the American people and in military history, but be that as it may, he was in command and he did his homework and he said, we will have to put 800,000 men on the ground in Korea if we are to drive the Chinese out. And ultimately, it would make no sense to drive them out unless we march all the way to Beijing. All right. And Eisenhower looked and he walked out of that and he turned to his military assistant, who is a General Goodpaster. And he said, this is outrageous. The American people won't support this. They have no interest in this. He said, we've got to end this. Lamar Clark was very bitter, but Eisenhower was right. What are we doing here? We don't need to be here. This is not life or death for us. And so what do? We restored the status quo ante, and it's held. And the big challenge right now is, in my judgment, is to get out of the place without starting another war. And I think that will happen because one of the lessons that's being learned by many, many people around the world is that we no longer have the power or the capability to protect them the way we did in the past. And so once he leaves the Middle East, which is what's going to happen, we are going to leave. I think people in Northeast Asia are going to say, well, then why are these Americans here? They can't really protect us anyway. And that's true. And oh, by the way, there was a time when Donald Trump thought they should protect themselves. And he was right. And we keep sort of insisting that every single potential opponent or competitor is some manifestation of Hitler or Stalin. The supposition that, well, China desperately wants in there. No, China doesn't want to go into any of these places. China wants to make money. China is interested in bankrolling itself. It's interested in preserving itself. I mean, they've been through plenty of wars. They're not interested in war. The Chinese would welcome our departure because, to be frank with you, if they have to make a choice between Crazy Kim in the North and the people in the Republic, guess who wins? The people in the Republic. And at that point, the Russians, who are really the only backers for President Kim, I mean, the Chinese are reluctantly there. He's going to be told, look, thanks for all your interest, but we don't want a war on a peninsula. Japanese don't want a war on a peninsula. So the idea, if we leave, then the whole world collapses, is just not true. And the world, particularly in Northeast Asia, is far more rational than we think, more rational than we are. So that brings us back to the Middle East. What happens? Well, I'm sure you're going to see the Turks and the Iranians emerge as the preeminent powers. The real question is, how does this artificial construct called Israel survive? And I don't have an easy answer. And that was my concern when this whole thing began, because I told my friends in Israel, I don't think Israel can survive this. And they said, just you watch.
Well, it can if it chooses to coexist peacefully, but the question is whether it can make that choice. And evidence so far suggests that it cannot make that choice because people are too invested in the whole kind of settler movement, the West Bank, and now Syria, Lebanon, picking fights with Turkey. There's not a lot of evidence that the Israelis are going to bought into this idea of just living peacefully with their neighbors, quite frankly, from what I see. Or do you see it differently? I mean, I can see very little evidence, frankly, of that.
How do you turn to the people that live around you that you have called subhuman, unworthy of life, and suddenly say, well, listen, let's sit down and talk? What reason is there for them to believe in anything you say? Now, maybe under the right financial conditions, the people that are running the show in the Arabian Peninsula will sell their people out again. That's possible. Although I'm beginning to hear a lot of rumblings in the Arabian Peninsula along the lines of getting rid of their elites, because the elites are held responsible for the terrible debacle that they confront right now. But when it comes to Turkey and to Persia, no, that's an entirely different set of circumstances. My concern is that with this Mr. Netanyahu coming to the funeral, that we're going to go into another round of escalatory action, that we are going to double down on failure. And I think we're going to probably experiment with some plan to go into Chabahar or wherever it may be, Karg Island. And maybe somebody is saying, well, listen, boss, if we can get in there and take this and put up the flag, we could say victory, and then maybe we can leave. Good God, I don't know.
Sort of Iwo Jima moment, but more catastrophic. All very kind of troubling. And it seems to me that the world is kind of radicalizing against US, particularly in the developing world, right now. And this is only going to be a benefit for China as it kind of develops its diplomatic relationships with the developing world. I mean, for what it's worth, I see some sort of normalization across the Islamic world, both to the east and the west of the Persian Gulf, as the ultimate corollary of this, where the Islamic world comes together in a more unified way on the back of an era in which kind of American and British and Israeli interference has actually almost insisted on division between, the Persians on the one side of the Gulf and the Arabians on the other side of the Gulf. I mean, that's how I see this kind of evolving. What happens to Israel? I don't know, except that actually they need to kind of find a way to kind of live peacefully, but I'm not sure they're capable of doing that. But in the short term, the prognosis is not very good.
Well, I suspect the Chinese will enable the kind of thing that you're describing, because BRICS is increasingly growing in strength. More countries are joining it. It's going to become more attractive because, frankly, we've weaponized all the institutions, financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF and so forth. And they're going to say, look, we're renouncing our debt. We're going to nationalize this out of the next thing. And they'll just join BRICS. And the Chinese and the Russians and India, everybody that's in BRICS, they'll say, join us, forget them. You don't need them. The hell with them. We keep talking about the debt trap that we claim China is trying to create. In reality, we're the masters of it. We force people into terrible debt. And then we've always tied it to this condition. Well, you've got to be like us. You have to mimic us in terms of your political structure. That's a losing proposition. Before we go, I had just taken a few minutes to go back and read some of the transcripts from discussions between Harold Macmillan and JFK. And I was interested in the Cuban Missile Crisis because at that point, JFK leaned very heavily on Harold Macmillan for advice. And I thought Macmillan's advice was excellent. And Macmillan subsequently also told him when he approached him, he said, well, we'd like you, if in the future, to join us in what we think will be a war in Vietnam against communism. And he said, not on your life. We're not going to do that. And of course, he pointed out, you just chased us out of several places. Now you want us to go back in. What happened to the Harold Macmillan School of British foreign policy? He seems to me to have been an eminently reasonable man who never lost sight of what was in the interest of the British people. Now, he may not have been perfect domestically. I mean, after all, he was from the upper class, and that's a problem for lots of people in Britain. I understand that. But he steered Britain away from some terrible things. And then, of course, he lost office, which was unfortunate. But anyway, what do you think about that? Does anybody ever talk in those terms? Do they even remember the man?
Well, yeah, I remember him, of course. I mean, it's before my time before I was born, but of course I remember the history of that. But I mean, you actually put the finger right on it when you said we want people to be just like us. we've lost the ability to kind of think rationally about foreign policy. That's the problem. We think emotionally about foreign policy. We want to kind of impose our values. We won't actually trade. We won't have political relationships with other countries if they don't share the same values as we have. I mean, I can walk down my street and find people with different values to mine, but still we can get along with each other. That's entirely fine. We've lost, as you say, we've lost sight of what our core strategic interests. And I say all the time that actually every country has three core strategic interests: to keep their border safe, to keep their people safe, and to provide for prosperity for the nation. And that nothing else, we want people to kind of have our values is utterly irrelevant. And yet we've become a hostage to this kind of values-based normative foreign policy, which is selling us out and leading us down rabbit holes like the war in Ukraine. We don't like Russia. Is it liking Russia or not liking Russia is irrelevant. How can we actually, have a relationship where our security, our prosperity, is, and our people are safe? And, you take energy security, for example. A rational foreign policy would say, well, it makes sense for us to have cheap energy from Russia just because that helps us. But people can no longer think in those terms because Putin's a demon. He may well be a demon, and he may not be a demon, but that's irrelevant to the consideration of a rational kind of foreign policy. And until we can get back to that, and I completely subscribe to that school of foreign policy, very few people in the UK do these days, and I worry that kind of not that many in the United States do either. We will be doomed to kind of Kool-Aid drinking, true believing leaders who just want to change the world in their kind of diminished image. I'm afraid that is my assessment.
No, I think you're probably right. Well, the difference, of course, is that most Americans on any given day are not really interested in what's happening overseas. They just aren't. And that means the field is left to the people who have agendas. And those agendas are antithetical to the interests of the American people.
Exactly right. And it's exactly right. And we layer them onto our foreign policies as if the other countries would find them remotely relevant or interesting. And of course they don't. And of course, in many cases, the countries find them antithetical to their way of life as well, which only causes, greater friction. So, completely right. Most people just don't care. As you say, they just don't care. They want their kids to be safe. They want to have food on the table. They want a good job. They want to kind of feel they have a purpose in life within their country, and actually, go on holidays, meet people from other countries, that's fine too, get along well with them, not have wars, and that sort of thing. Most people just don't care about these foreign wars, and that's why we should kind of, get rid of people who insist on taking us down these ridiculous kind of foreign policy traps that we seem to find ourselves in, repeatedly through history since the end of the Second World War. But that's a rather dark way to end it.
Well, for whatever it's worth, I might just give my Substack a quick plug for you.
Please do.
If you go on to it, it's called Macgregor Warrior Diplomacy. And a new piece is going to show up by Friday. It's called Trump's War to the Last Missile, where I go into some detail about what we were discussing, the futility of this employing ground forces, the futility of renewing bombing and so forth, but also point to something that very few people are aware of, and that is that we're not really at war, and we cannot ramp up our industrial base to produce enough missiles and unmanned systems within the requisite time desired and in the quantities needed to defeat Iran. We just can't do it. And people say, well, this is outrageous. We should be able to defeat Iran. Well, wait a minute. You only maintain military power as a hedge, really, strategic hedge against the possibility that you may be compelled to fight. I mean, that used to be the theory. Well, if we have to fight, well, we'll have enough that we can protect ourselves while we then swing into action, mobilize the country, and so forth. And I go into some detail on that I think may be of interest to your readers, and then, go through some of the more serious mistakes that we made since Trump took office. Mistake number one, I think, was not getting involved to bring this war in Ukraine to an end, telling the European allies this needs to end, it's in no one's interest. And then cutting off the Ukrainians and saying, look, either you sit down and accept a framework for discussion, or we're out, because we're not going to bankroll your war in perpetuity. That's mistake number one. He could have done that. And there was still a lot of goodwill in Moscow towards us. That's almost all gone now. I think they've figured out, he's the yo-yo. Don't believe anything he says. It's a waste of time. And I think the second thing was, of course, deciding to go to war under pressure from the Jewish lobby without really understanding what you were walking into, with catastrophic outcomes. And then finally, the other point is this tariff war on China. which we can't win and did not win. We lost it. It harmed us. And we could have found better ways to go forward. If you take those three things and you look at what we want to do now in the hopes that we can rectify the mess in the Gulf, you can't do it. You need to walk away from it. You need to change direction. But, Ian, as you know, making profound change is a difficult thing in any structure, but for a republic, especially when people have made outrageous statements from which they cannot retreat, becomes almost impossible.
Well, that's why we need more diplomats, because diplomats avoid making outrageous statements they can't withdraw from, and we need more people who speak in measured terms. Frankly, as statespeople, our leaders, and there's everybody's playing to the media gallery. They're one of the core problems we have with the diplomacy, although I think we've largely abandoned diplomacy, is our fixation on talking to the lobby, not talking to the people we most need to talk to, and that's our adversaries. This belief that we could just not talk to Putin and that will be okay, because he's not nice, he says hurty things, will prove with history to be a catastrophic mistake, because we're losing and will be seen to have lost. And diplomacy is not about liking people; it's about getting coexisting and finding a way not to kill each other, basically. And we've kind of catastrophically lost sight of that, I'm afraid to say. But here's to more moderation.
Well, tell everybody else I missed them. I thought I might see Jeremy here today.
Steve and Polly. We just had a message yesterday. We're just chatting. We should get another kind of four-way going again. That's a lot of fun, actually, when we did that. But we talk every day. We have a little WhatsApp discussion group, the three of us. So I'll pass on your good regards. Thank you very much for thinking of them. But thank you for joining today. I really appreciate your time. Incredibly busy you are. I like Water the Last Missile. I may even use that as the heading in my video and actually put a link to your Substack in the description box as well, so that people can read that. And I shall read that immediately after we finish this call. So thanks again, Doug. I really appreciate your time today.
Okay. Thank you, Ian.